A concern raised by a citizen earlier this year about lighting in downtown Minot prompted city leaders to take a look at ordinances. The current ordinance allows for ornamental lighting to be displayed without restriction below 16 feet. Now in August, a downtown resident raised a concern about certain lighting installed above 16 feet. Tim Bauman, the vice chair of the city's planning commission, says some recommendations came before that commission on how to address it. However, Bauman says they felt it was not quite ready and asked the full city council to direct staff to create a sample of nuisance light. The council approved a motion last night to direct staff to prepare an ordinance that reflects the thought process on lighting, similar to what is currently on the books for noise. Bauman adds that this won't quite address the issue, but it makes sure the city is prepared for future disputes with mechanisms to address it.
They have once again directed staff to look at the creation or some sort of mechanism to deal with maybe nuisance lighting violations and create something within our city ordinances that there is a way to address complaints between neighbors.
Now, Bauman says this is the first time an issue like this has come before the city during his time on the commission. We'll follow up with the city on what the sample ordinance would look like.